Der 6. Parteitag der Bewegung geht zu Ende. Was für Millionen Deutsche, die außerhalb unserer Reihen stehen, vielleicht nur als imposantes Schauspiel politischer Machtentfaltung gewertet wird, war für die Hunderttausende der Kämpfer unendlich mehr. Das große persönliche und geistige Treffen der alten Streiter und Kampfgenossen. Und vielleicht hat mancher unter ihnen trotz der zwingenden Großartigkeit dieser Herrscher unserer Partei sich wehmütigen Herzens zurückbesonnen in jene Tage, da es so schwer war, Nationalsozialist zu sein. Denn als unsere Partei gerade 7-mal hoch war, sprach sie schon ein Grundsätze aus. Erstens, sie wollte eine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Und zweitens, sie wollte daher kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
See, that was his style. But he had a large following, and the way he speaks, probably you could not expect anything else. Then what happened? The way his followers followed him. Now Martin Luther King. Yes. Yes. Now this is probably a very good speech by Martin Luther King.
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation. I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as the great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. So we've come here today to dramatize the shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to catch a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men.
So this is probably one of the best speeches of 20th century. And it is because of Martin Luther King that Obama became the president. If it was not for him, there was no question. At that time, there was no voting right. Now, his clarity and his ability to hold the audience depends on his modulation. Clarity depends on the way he has used his speech organs. Yeah. Now, I like to play to you Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Very little time. He was one of the greatest orators so far as India is concerned. He was using pauses but a little more. He was great.
कि परमाणु परीक्षण की भी आलोचना की गई। पूछा गया देश के सामने कौन सा खतरा था। मैं 1974 में सदन में था जब श्रीमती इंदिरा गांधी के नेतृत्व में परमाणु परीक्षण किया गया था। हमने उसका स्वागत किया था, प्रतिपक्ष में थे फिर भी स्वागत किया था क्योंकि देश की रक्षा के लिए वो किया गया था।
Modulation.
उस समय कौन सा खतरा था? क्या आत्मरक्षा की तैयारी तभी होगी जब खतरा होगा? अगर तैयारी पहले से हो तो जो खतरा अगर आने वाला तो खतरा भी दूर हो जाएगा।
To be with you today for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Truth be told, I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why did I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. and all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.
Very well with our audience. 1. Modulation. 2.
They are confident.
Confidence because they are speaking from everyone. Each one of them, it appears that they are not bothered of what the world will say. They are only desirous of expressing themselves. Now, on page 54, we have this speech of Martin Luther King. So I want you to experience, it is not very difficult to feel, like him. Yes?
For what?
Martin Luther King's speech. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came in as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Yes? So you start from the beginning. Yeah.
Please don't laugh.
I am happy to join with you
A
today.
little more. Take it. I am happy. Yes.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration of freedom in the history of our nation.
Longer pauses.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
Take it up.
100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
Take it up.
100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land. And so, we have come here today to dramatize a shameful condition.
Next.
We have come to our nation's capital.
No. In a sense, now when you are addressing a large crowd, you will have very small, you have to give breaks. Your phrases will be very small. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of Constitution and the Declaration of Independence like this. Continue.
In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check.
Longer pause.
When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were singing a promissory note.
They were signing a promissory note. Take a deeper breath.
They were signing a promissory note to which every American was to full had. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as our citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. A check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so, we have come to cash the check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of radical justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
Thank you. Anyone else? Give him a big hand. Yes. This pace you have to reduce.
Okay.
It would be fatal for the nation. Yeah.
It would be fatal for the nation
to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963.
For recording.
1963 is not an end, but a beginning. And those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. And there will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges.
Anyone else? But there is something.
But there is something that I must say to my people.
Pace to control it. And keep it a little closer. But there is something.
But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice.
Longer pauses.
In the process of gaining
our rightful place.
In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever...
Longer pause. And take a deep breath. Whenever you take pause, you take a deep breath. Yes.
We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom.
Okay, give her a big hand. See, what I am suggesting is, if you practice something like this, then if nothing else, you will raise your self-esteem, because I think there is in everyone the talent which needs to be inculcated, which needs to be exposed. Yeah. So, good night.
Thank you.
We can have a group photograph.